grassy knoll. This is part 8 of, I guess, a 10-part series that we've entitled Magicians of Mutability. And with us for this hour is Paul Collins, his books, The Hidden Face of Terrorism, and the one he co-authored with his brother Philip, The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship. If you've been to the series, you know the full title, and you probably don't want me to say it anymore, but at any rate. Paul, we thank you for being with us for this part 8.
Glad to be here, Viz.
All right, now, where we left off, and we were talking, central to this whole interview, as it was to part 7, was the Abu Ghraib piece that you wrote about this kind of torture taking place and its role, perhaps, in our sociology. But something that's part and parcel of an elite supremacy doctrine. Was that in place prior to 9/11? And if so, who might be, say, the chief advocate of such?
Yes, we do see the practice of this elite supremacy doctrine prior to September 11th, Viz. And we see it, the key practitioner, as far as, we see it going back literally thousands of years into antiquity, but that was so voluminous I could, of course, not in the length of an article and all. But the key practitioner that I looked at when it came to this supremacy doctrine was the individual known as Robert McNamara. He was the Secretary of Defense at one time, and he was a key practitioner of this elite tradition. And McNamara devised what was known as Project 100,000. And most Americans have no idea what this project was. They're completely ignorant to the fact that it even went on in this country. Once again, we have this problem where there's a veil over the common American's eyes. This veil that says, well, you know, the hollowed halls of officialdom, my government, Uncle Sam, would never do anything harmful towards me, and would never act in a harmful way. And this naive, childish want to and desire to believe the best in the established authority and whatnot, which I can see to a point. You know, everybody needs some security, but in this case, it's kept people from seeing certain facts concerning certain players within our government, and it's kept people from seeing certain case studies. And one of those case studies, as I mentioned, is the Project 100,000, looking to protect some of his rich friends from the draft. And he arranged for the recruitment of people who had failed the armed services test to actually go into the military. Originally, these people, because they had failed the armed services test, were considered ineligible. But through his arrangements through this Project 100,000, these men were actually let in. Men who had failed their IQ test, people from the underclass, from the urban ghettos, the poor rural South. These people were the people who were brought in to the military through Project 100,000. 41% of Project 100,000 were African American, and 40% of Project 100,000 were trained for combat. Now, what people have to keep in mind, Viz, when we're looking at this, is that these guys ended up in Vietnam during a time when McNamara, if you look at his public statements, well, actually not his public statements, but look at the different biographies out there over the man, and what we now know, what has been disclosed. McNamara was at this time privately confessing his sentiment that the war could not be won. So these poor individuals were essentially being sent on what McNamara knew to be a suicide mission. And another thing that people have to consider was that this was 1966, the time that the civil rights movement was gaining ground. So equality may have been in vogue, but the elite tradition had McNamara going in the opposite direction. and he was waging what I would call essentially class warfare against the people, even though there was supposed to be this paradigm shift going on where dignity and mutual respect between the different so-called races of humanity was gaining ground.
Thinking about this eliteness and what's going on right now, do you think that we're headed for a more perfect beast of a soldier by any kind of implants? We had on again Dr. Daigle, who said that black ops or special ops are chipped in at least 3 locations, one of which is to find out where they are on the battlefield at all times, and then he led he was led to talk about what the other 2 might be for, and how when they had that rash of murders down in Fort Bragg from soldiers coming back from Iraq, that maybe perhaps they weren't deprogrammed. So with this idea of a techno/human being, do you think that's in the offing for the military?
I see it definitely coming into being. I saw this, however, coming even without the technological augmentation. People have got to understand that going straight back to the Civil War, the elites found that there was this fundamental problem that they had to deal with when getting the common man to become a combatant. During the Civil War, it was found that people were hesitant to fire on one another when they realized and when they knew that the other person that they were firing on, whether they were wearing a gray or a blue uniform, was another American. And so the elite began to look into this problem through different study groups, through different think tanks, on how do you break down this timidity, these reservations that one might have when it comes to when it comes to fighting somebody and killing somebody that on a regular basis you might consider your friend. And we've seen the breaking down of this timidity, so to speak, these reservations through training with virtual reality, with training with computer programs where it becomes almost instinctual. It becomes simply reactive, and the part of the mind that looks into serious moral questions actually switches off, and the person is simply reactive. Well, first of all, let me say this. I think you might have seen some of the video that was sent back via the internet about some of the way that our soldiers talked, and maybe they're not the only ones, but some of the I guess you would want to say controlled, very calm manner in which they talked about taking a life. Yes, it would make Hitler cringe.
Yeah, and I mean the one, I don't know if you saw that, where they've got a wounded Iraqi laying out in the street, and they just basically talk about him, and they shoot him. It's like, wow, is that awesome?
Yeah, while I have not seen the footage, I have read extensively about that. And again, what we see is this switching off of the part of the mind that questions the moral ramifications of one's behavior, and the simply switching into a gear where it becomes reactive. It becomes it becomes little more than the equivalent of swatting a fly. And I would like to suggest that somebody who has extensively about the kind of indoctrination that we see here, and which involved also certain individuals involved in the MK Ultra experiments, would be an individual. He's a little bit left of center. I would say that to the audience before they go reading him. So take that with tongue in cheek. But is the author Frank Morales. and he's written extensively about this, about how this paradigm shift in the way that the common soldier thinks has come about.
Well, again, with going back to your article, which is the centerpiece of what we're doing today and what we had done in the last show, what we saw at Abu Ghraib, what kind of payoffs were there? Was part of it desensitizing us? Did it really reveal something ugly that we chided where our military leaders are going? Like someone said, they weren't well trained. What, to be a human being?
Exactly.
Come on. So what's the deal with Abu Ghraib? Why did it get into the media? What is your take on that? Okay, well, in his book, The Power Elite, which is a virtual tome about the so-called ruling class, the oligarchs, C. Wright Meals contends that the power elite wield control over the military. And with the Abu Ghraib incident, we see the suggestion that the elite supremacy doctrine has been transmitted to the military. And I want to let the audience know that there may be several transmission belts for this, more than what my article could go into and more than length and time allowed. However, the one that I identify is in an article in Parameters. Now, it's important for people to realize that Parameters is not something that you go down to your defense commissary while going to buy groceries and just pick up with the employment guides and the retirement life, newsletters and whatnot. It's not that kind of a publication. It's the Army War College Journal, which is considered to be the journal that lays down the doctrine, if you will, that's going to be preached and taught throughout the military. And this article that he wrote for that was written for Parameters, was entitled "The New Warrior Class," and it was written by Ralph Peters, who was at that time a major. And in his article, Peters contends that the United States Army will no longer be facing soldiers, but what he terms warriors. And he calls these warriors erratic primitives that have no stake in civil order. And these are people he obviously feels is inferior. And it's interesting to note his footnotes for this article. Peters has derived a lot from the writer Samuel Huntington, who wrote the Clash of Civilizations, and who is basically a comrade of Zbigniew Brzezinski. So this article can be considered a transmission belt from the elite, this supremacy doctrine, into the military. And Peters suggests that these erratic primitives come from 4 social pools. The first is the underclass, and he considers this someone of little education who lacks physical attractiveness, and curiously enough, this is someone who is also a nationalist. So we see this attack on people that might have reservations about the whole New World Order concept, about the idea of national sovereignty, and the equating of nationalism with racism, with primitive violent thought. Whereas you and I would understand, Viz, that the whole idea of national sovereignty is actually a separation of powers, instead of all economic and political and military power being concentrated in one entity, thus ensuring a dictatorship. It's disseminated amongst the various nation states. The second group that Peters attacks is the young dissenters. He considers these to be erratic primitives and warriors as well. He says that they're disturbed by the disruption of traditional institutions that have acted as the glue of society and have maintained civilization's stability. Now, given your and my reverence for the Ten Commandments,
and for the different freedom documents, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, we might as well fall right into this group. And other different groups different institutions that have made up the glue of society, such as family, formal worship systems, and communities. These are what the young dissenter clings to, and these are now being undermined by the elite's establishment of a world oligarchical system, and Peters recognizes this, and recognizes that the elites are pushing us towards a world government, which means the eventual eclipse of national sovereignty, and so he knows that the young dissenters are going to be a problem when it comes to establishing this new system, and so they have become, in essence, part of the warrior class that must be fought. That brings me to the third tool that he identifies as a problem, which is the patriots. The patriots. Now, patriots have suffered a personal loss. And we see this going back into the 90s when these militia groups were forming and whatnot, which seemed to me to be misguided in some ways, but I can see where their fears were legitimate. We had suffered a personal loss through free trade, NAFTA, and GATT, which induced the loss of jobs and loss of liberty, and oppressive legislature that had come through different such as what Bill Clinton had set up after the OKC bombing. Patriots have problems with these things and have objections to these different aspects, and they're going to stand up and say no. So Peters considers them to be part of the warrior class that must be fought. And the final pool that Peters identifies as a problem is the military men that come from what he considers to be an obsolete military paradigm. They're dispossessed, cashiered, may have been considered failures, basically the Michael New types. If you'll recall, and I'm sure that the audience is familiar with Michael New, who said, no, I'm not going to put on the United Nations helmet and band, and I'm not going to serve under United Nations command. That's at least the impression that I was under when reading the article, that's what his idea of this final pool of so-called warriors was. Someone like Michael New, a person who doesn't like the military's new way of doing things. And the military has become less about national defense and more about being an international police force keeping the rabble in line. Finally, after he sums up all these different social pools, Peters puts forward the way that one deals with the warrior classes, and he gives a two-track approach. The first track is an active campaign to win over the populace, and if you're like me, you'll read that as brainwashing. Mm-hmm. The second track is an irresistible violence directed at the warlords and the warriors. And we saw this. We saw this two-track approach, in my opinion, employed at Abu Ghraib. The prisoners were treated with irresistible violence. If you'll recall, and if you've seen the pictures that I have seen, there's certainly nothing peaceful, nothing gentle about putting a naked man on a leash or attacking a nude prisoner with an attack dog. And the prisoners, the idea that you could rehabilitate these individuals was absolutely precluded. There was no idea that these people could be re-indoctrinated and could leave behind the violent impulses of militant radical Islam. So the idea of prisoner rehabilitation was precluded because the Iraqis were considered not soldiers. They were considered warriors. And Peters says, in regards to warriors, quote, "You cannot teach them a lesson."
Wow. Well, so then, what? Let me go back to asking you, What do you think America picked up from the exposure of Abu Ghraib and other forms of torture?
I think that it was in part desensitizing us to the idea of torture, and leading us down the track that Alan Dershowitz has been trying to lead people. Alan Dershowitz being the liberal lawyer who has actually come forward in favor of torture. This idea that yeah, it might be rough, yes, it might look harsh and all, but it's a necessary evil. That's at least the sense that I have gotten from the media exposure when it comes to the channels that I watch, in particular Fox News, which seems to be this haven of neoconservative ideas, and not just the news and media outlets, but also the entertainment outlets. A show that I've watched with some regularity on the regular Fox channel is the television show 24, and they've had no less than 3 mind-boggling torture sequences on that show, all of which were committed, I might add, by the individuals that we are supposed to view, according to the individuals who write the scripts for this show, as the heroes. I think it's supposed to give that the Abu Ghraib media exposure is supposed to desensitize us to the idea of torture, and to give us the idea that while it might be rough, while it might seem harsh, that it is a necessary evil. And again, I believe I said this before in the last show over Abu Ghraib, but it bears repeating. Jefferson said that in government there is no such thing as necessary evil, and that the evil can only be found in government excesses. And so people have to keep that in mind when they watch their television screens and something pops up over Abu Ghraib.
I don't consort with people like this, and so this is why I'm going to take a guess. But I wonder how many out there say it's okay because it's them and not us, as if the ones who are recipients of torture right now, obviously people in other lands, whether it's like, well, too bad, better us, better them than us. Do you think that there was a part of this whole episode that some people could say, well, that's justifiable, that's them, any means necessary?
I believe so. I believe that in recent years that the Arab people have been played up as being individuals who resemble what Peters was speaking about in his article for parameters. Even long before that article was written, I believe they were played up in this manner in the media, and more importantly in entertainment. A person that doesn't watch the news most definitely watches some television show or some movie, and the picture that is portrayed of them is just of this savage, this savage, brutal individual. And so in the regular common person's mind, the idea is, well, yes, better than us, and after all, they're not like us in any way. And you kind of get the idea that people don't even think that these prisoners that were abused would feel pain like you and I do, but they do. And the problem is that the whole idea in the public's mind has shifted away from these people being soldiers to being warriors, and that the definition for a warrior is totally completely different than the definition of a soldier. A warrior is considered somebody who loves war, who loves combat, who loves killing, and just thrives on violence. And when you see an individual in that light, you do have a better them than me mentality, and you do have a mentality that says, well, look, I see the pictures. I see these people being exposed to sexual degradation and to different forms of torture and beating. But I have to keep in mind they're not like me, and and therefore there's nothing objectionable about that kind of tactic being employed when dealing with this sort.
We're going to talk about that Michael Aquino situation in the second half hour. I've not forgotten that, and I want to let you know that we'll be heading down that road. I was left an article in my mailbox at work from a coworker I seldom see, different shift, and the person was very, very upset by this story, which ran under the headline, and this was CBS News: CIA flying suspects to torture, ? And when I did get a chance to see the individual, I said, and I'm going to ask you how you feel about this, Paul. I'm saying, that's kind of probably a little misdirection. They want you to follow that down a rabbit hole because they don't have to fly anybody out of the United States to do that. I think that somehow this was made to sanitize that the CIA wouldn't do it here on our own home soil or down in Gitmo or wherever Padilla is. And so how do you feel about that? Do you feel that this was not necessarily a red herring, but somehow this removed us from the fact that we do this, at home?
It makes us look at, it makes us shift our eyes away from things going on here in our own country, and makes us begin to look in other regions of the world. When real, honest to God, legitimate atrocities could be perpetrated right under our noses here at home. While you're looking at planes taking off for other countries, where the laws against torture might not exist, so that these prisoners could in fact be tortured. Here at home, we have protests going on against different things that the public finds objectionable, and in response to these protests, the police will come out, and the police have become increasingly more militarized, and will use all these different devices on the crowds that some cause nausea, some induce different sorts of pain, and I would suggest that these are just as much legitimate examples of torture as somebody sitting over in a cell in Peru being shocked or being drowned is a legitimate example. I believe you're right on with that, Viz. I think that it is meant to distract. That's not to say that this hasn't gone on. That the Central Intelligence Agency doesn't bring these individuals over to other countries where the human rights are more laxed and whatnot. But we have to always be looking at what's going on in our own backyards when the media wants us to shift our attention away from home.
Well, look what's happened in the last number of years with the way protesters are treated. And here, once again, we have the yin and the yang. They have a peaceful protest, mostly directed toward the G7 or G8. And all of a sudden, these strange anarchists pop up with ski masks on, dressed in black, throwing garbage cans through windows, acting like idiots. Then they withdraw from the scene, and coincidentally, guess who shows up but the police, and they let loose on the peaceful protesters while this strange anarchist group just sort of disappears. And they follow that scenario, not only in the United States, of course. They had a nasty situation out in Italy. But are we realizing what's happening? I mean, with that Republican national in New York, Alex Jones did a pretty nice piece on that. Took his camera with him, and got a lot of this that people don't see on the news. And I'm saying, look how we are being treated. Now protesters have to go off to some pen and exercise their free speech, from behind chain link fences. I mean, have you watched how this has also happened in our own country with this feeling of, go ahead, let the dogs loose on them?
Yes, I have. And people don't realize how the First Amendment to the Constitution in the Bill of Rights is seriously been affected by this, by all of this, these so-called needed measures. They pass them off, hawk them off as measures that are needed to keep a crowd in control and whatnot. But when you look at these different technologies that are being used and the different strategies that are used against the protesters, many of which, like you said, are not the violent factions of the protest and all. What you see is not so much an attempt to keep a crowd in check as much as it is to conduct a war on dissent. And when you have a war on dissent, you have a war directly on the First Amendment to the Constitution, the idea of freedom of speech, of peacefully gathering together and voicing one's disdain for something or objections to something that might be going on. That's what we're seeing with this. Is we're seeing a war on dissent and thus a war on the First Amendment to the Constitution.
Once again, this is the Grassy Knoll and Dade City Micro Radio. We have with us Paul Collins, his books, The Hidden Face of Terrorism and the Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship. What we're talking about in this Part 8 of the series, Magicians of Mutability, is the article that he wrote, and that's still up there on Paranoia Magazine, is it not?
Yes, that's correct. It's still up.
Okay, and what is the formal title of that? I just keep referring it to as the Abu Ghraib piece, but...
The title, gosh, now it even slips my mind.
Well, I don't feel so bad.
Yeah, it's called the Psychology of Abu Ghraib, and all they have to do is just www.paranoiamagazine, all lowercase, all one word, .com, and go to the articles section, and it's right there under the articles listed under the author Paul Collins. It's called The Psychology of Abu Ghraib.
Also, I just want to throw this out, kind of a light note before we get back into some heavy business. I see that in that article you quoted Eric Margolis from the Toronto Sun. Did you ever speak to Eric?
No, I haven't. I quoted Eric Margolis also in my book, The Hidden Face of Terrorism, because he pointed out an interesting aspect to the Northern Alliance characters coming in and replacing the Taliban that I had not seen, and that most researchers haven't seen, where it's essentially a reestablishing of the regime that the Afghan war was supposed to get rid of. Those communist sympathizers, or maybe even communists themselves, the people that were loyal to the Soviet Union, government that was friendly to the Soviet Union, being reinstalled there in Afghanistan, which does away with this whole idea that the movements that we had in Afghanistan post September 11th were about bringing freedom and the ideas of democracy and constitutional republicanism to that region of the world.
Well, before I'll get back to Eric in a second. It wasn't a real big deal, but also this drug trafficking globally, which was reinstituted when they got the Taliban out of Afghanistan, that also may be behind the story. And I'm not saying the guy's a great guy, but Milosevic might have been, shall we say, damaging to global drug running into Europe, done mostly by apparently the KLM, and then they made him the demon, because he was going through this ethnic cleansing, which they may have been also. But the point was that he was interfering with global drug trafficking, and he had to go. Did you pick up on any of that at all? Yes,
actually I agree with you entirely on that. Milosevic had been, I haven't kept up with his case, but last time that I had been watching about his trial being held, he was very eager to get up and to speak on this issue. It's almost as if he just wanted to spill the beans entirely, and I know that they were hesitant let him speak his mind. But like you said, the KLA over there, where in that region of the world, were and still are some of the biggest drug dealers, and have a heavy muscle when it comes to the international drug market. And it's also interesting to note something that was pointed out by former DEA agent Michael Levine. Mike Levine points out that the KLA was actually received support and training from members of Al Qaeda. And so I think it's exactly like as you stated it, and I think that Milosevic knows more about this than what we're being told in the media, and he's really eager to share his share what he knows about this now. What's he got to lose anyways at this juncture, and to just spill the beans and to bring this whole pyramid crashing down.
Yeah. Well, by the way, the brainiac that I am, what did I say? I said the KLM. I only just insulted an entire airline. But
that's all right.
I don't even know if they're still running. I'm not sure. But anyway, yeah, okay. I knew I'd come up with that anagram somehow, some way. Also, one last word about Eric Margolis. You're going to love this. I nearly swallowed my tongue when he said this right at the end of the interview. And he was with us for an hour. He's really pretty fast-paced and a lot of fun. Didn't agree with a lot of stuff he had to say, but that doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But at the very end, here's a guy who considers himself, a Republican for the most part, a conservative, and one of the last comments he made. Oh, by the way, also he thinks the Vatican is great.
Yeah.
Well, he went to, where did he go to school? Yeah, he went to Georgetown, I think. I don't know, so you understand where that's coming from.
Mm-hmm.
But the Vatican's great. Schwarzenegger's great. And the thing that blew me away is he goes, and you know what? We've got to get rid of these national sovereignties and borders. And I'm saying to myself, I have never, ever heard a Republican conservative ever get involved with that. So I was like, gulp, anyway. It was a good interview. If anybody gets a chance, check that out to see his take on things. He's spending a lot of time in Afghanistan and India also. Now, back to this thing about tribunals, which is what Milosevic is undergoing. This is the new international law without a jury. And this is one of the things, and we'll talk about this in part 10, I think. I like to keep most of it for that. Paul, it's like slowly we're getting involved in this internationalism, which is undercutting the Constitution, because they talk about these tribunals. And when you have a tribunal, like you saw in Nuremberg, sorry, no juries. And that's a very scary element that's starting to seep in, where you can be this I guess, citizen of the world and tried anywhere or under any kind of law other than your own.
That's correct. That's absolutely correct. The Constitution, what we have made provisions for us under the freedom documents, is a fair and speedy trial by our peers. Well, it's not going to be your peers that oversee your case or hear the case for and against you in an international tribunal. It's going to be made up of individuals that may be unfriendly and hostile towards your country and towards your values and thus towards you. I personally would not want to be right now currently in a courtroom where the jurors were made up of French and certain Middle Eastern countries, because right now, whether good or bad, right or wrong, they hate us. And so, what we have is this danger of the individual's right to a fair and speedy trial by one's own peers being thrown out the window. And the Milosevic case is supposed to set a precedent for this, a precedent for the idea of having a court that supersedes any national court and is basically made up of judges from other countries and is essentially court of the world. Whether it ends up being the ICC or something else, I don't know. But I do know that the blueprint is there, and it's been spoken about in several different elites tracks and different elites predictions for the future. So we know that that's desirable, and we know that's what they want, and that's what they're working for with cases like Milos's case, providing precedents for the idea of this kind of a court.
Well, every so often, I look at Harry, and one of us invariably will ask the other, like, where's Noriega? Where's Milosevic? Where do these people go? I mean, so anyway, you know where I'm going with that, and enough said. But, I mean, they're sitting on a lot of people, not in the spirit of, the United States Constitution or its legislation. I want to go back to the Peters thing. By the way, did you cite a particular issue or date that article was in, and what is the title again?
The title of the article is The New Warrior Class, and it's in Parameters magazine. And once again, I want the audience to know that that's not something you're going to pick up at the defense commissary or at the mess hall. That's an article in the Army War College Journal. So this carries clout. It carries weight. It was the copy that I had. I got off of their archives on the net that you can get at parameters.com, and it was written in 1994.
Okay. Also, when you're there, folks, if you're going to go check that out, and you also going to run a search on this too with Ralph Peters, plus whatever. Parameters. He also had an article which knocked my eyeballs out, and that was from Summers 1997, entitled Constant Conflict. And I'm thinking to myself, well, Trotsky couldn't have said it any better. Before we go into the Aquino situation that we're going to finish up with, is that okay with you?
Yeah, that's fine.
I mean, I'm looking at this guy going, what are you thinking about? I mean, just 3 real quick clips. And this is, again, from Constant Conflict by Ralph Peters, on the same website from which Paul was reading from the other article. He says, we're entering a new American century in which we will become still wealthier, culturally more lethal, and increasingly powerful. We will excite hatreds without precedent. Beautiful. Later on, he says, we will outcreate, outproduce, and when need be, outfight the rest of the world. We can outthink them, too. And then lastly, I mean, this is some kind of rhetoric. The advent of this new information age has opened a fresh chapter in the human struggle for and with freedom. It will be a bloody chapter with plenty of computer smashing and head bashing. Holy man, I won't even go on. I mean, it gets. I mean, you can see the guy salivating.
It's enough to put a smile on Irving Kristol's face.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm sitting with this, and I'm not going to deal with it right now. We can maybe visit this in 10. But I wanted to sneak it in also, and that is the connection between Kristol and all these other Straussians that are hanging around, who are so right, they're left. I mean, like we said, the Democrats go from one end with the social welfare state. The Republicans go from, crypto-fascists, endless conflict, so it's, both of them get you to the same place, and that's fascism.
That's correct.
Now, one of the things that bothered me early on in the war, and I didn't see too much about it later on, and again, I don't know, this goes back to World War II, in other places, I don't know. But I was getting snapshots, again, back through the internet, and I was seeing soldiers, given the satanic horns, the index finger and the pinky, hooked, right? I mean, that ain't Texas A&M, guys, or Texas. And also, I was seeing trucks with the beast on it, or helicopters with 666, and I'm going, what is going on here? Now, I do not know a lot about this. You asked me, so I'm giving it to you for the rest of the show, and that is there a cult of evil? Is there Satanism? I mean, is this part of now the perfect killing machine? What is going on with that?
What I think that we're seeing with this trend that you're talking about, I don't think that we're looking at anything that is coincidental in any way whatsoever. There is a satanic tradition within the military that I trace back to a very influential individual named Michael Aquino, who was in the military and was at the Presidio, and this individual was an adherent to Anton LaVey. he became disenchanted with LaVey and eventually broke with LaVey because he found that LaVey just didn't take his Satanism serious enough. He didn't like the vaudeville antics. He didn't like people like James Mansfield or several other different Hollywood celebrities coming into the fold and just making a circus out of the whole thing. He wanted hardcore, real, honest, orthodox, if you will, religious fervor when it came to the topic of Satanism. So he formed what was called the Temple of Set. And the Temple of Set was in the military, and there were several practitioners in the ranks of the military that belonged to the Temple of Set. And what eventually happened was that Aquino was accused of having molested and sexually mistreated children at the military base there, the Presidio. And there's an excellent article from the San Jose Mercury going back several years, written by a very gutsy lady named Linda Goldston. And I believe that anybody can drop her name into the search engine on the World Wide Web and find this article archived by somebody. I forget where I received my copy, but Linda Goldston wrote an article called "Army of the Night" that documented this whole affair. These children were coming home with sexually transmitted diseases, and what I'd ask the audience is how are you going to tell me that these single-digit age children are sexually active and sexually promiscuous? Something was obviously going on here, and they were identifying Michael Aquino and associates of Aquino as being involved in this whole thing, and as having been involved in molesting them. Linda Goldston ended up going to several of the places where this supposedly took place. She went to a bunker and found occult paraphernalia in this bunker, and found several different features and aspects that matched up to the children's accounts. But the Michael Aquino was never, or Aquino, or however it's said, was never found guilty. The military was very hush about it and just quietly drummed him out of the military. But what we see with Abu Ghraib, and what we see with the different things that you spoke about, the flashing of the goat of Mendes symbol with the fingers, and once again, not everybody is a Texas Longhorn fan.
Right.
This is obviously has meaning and significance far beyond athleticism or organized sports. What I believe we see is a continuation in the military of this Aquino satanic tradition. And if you look at the pictures of Abu Ghraib and the different things that went on there, you can see a kind of method to the madness. For instance, and I won't get too graphic because we don't need to go there too much, but one of the more milder things that we can talk about is these soldiers' nude bodies being piled up into the form of a pyramid. And what that semiotically suggests, is several different occult ideas. We also have, basically the reduction of human beings from the level of human to the level of beast by putting leashes on them, by making them do different things that only animals would do, and that's the core precept. That's putting into practice the core precept of Satanism, which is that man is a beast. And so well, I want people to consider, and of course that's why I wrote the whole article, the idea that with Abu Ghraib we were seeing this elite supremacy doctrine transmitted into the military and being put into practice by the military. I want the audience to also understand and consider that this could very well be a manifestation of that Kino satanic tradition once more in the military, and a continuation of that. And if that's the case, then we have several different questions to ask. Well, why didn't the military establishment clean out their house? In the name of religious tolerance, did they keep did they allow this tradition to go on, even though it's obvious that such a tradition is not protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution? We do have freedom of religion, but it also should be noted that your freedom's where my nose begins, and we just don't see these practices being covered by that First Amendment protection.
All right. Well, again, I referred before to the situation at Fort Bragg, where soldiers kind of flipped out in a percentage that you don't usually see. And now I'm thinking back. You got me thinking whether or not there was some element also that Satanism was mentioned. Can you think back at all to that? Does that ring a bell with you at all?
Well, I know that Fort Bragg has also been mentioned as far as CIA mind control experiments and possible continuation of MK Ultra, and we know that MK Ultra had an occult aspect to it, and so occultism might have played in that respect, and then but then also once again it could have been this Aquino or Aquino tradition being carried on there as well. I've heard some of the most craziest tales and different stories coming out of Fort Bragg, to the extent that you're like, good grief, what's true and what's and what's just imagination here. I can't see all of it being made up, but something is definitely going on there, and it either goes back to these MK Ultra experiments, which would bring us back into the occult, or to the Aquino tradition, which also brings us back to the occult. In which case, both roads lead to Rome, don't they?
Yeah, and we haven't talked about yet about MK Ultra. And a lot of people think that that's crazy, and what I do is I keep around a printout of the Senate subcommittee hearings that Frank Church led. I think that was back in around...
I think that was 76, wasn't it?
77, yeah, 76, 77.
Yeah, the infamous year of intelligence, because there just was this outpouring of all these different revelations and whatnot.
Well, I heard on Black Op Radio a couple of years ago, I believe the gentleman's name was John McCarthy, who was in the service and was set up for supposedly killing, I guess, a Viet Cong. He might have been a double agent or whatever. But anyway, he mentions that, I guess, in answer to one of the questions that were put to him, that MK Ultra was like started right after World War II, and it might have something to do with Operation Paperclip and bringing over people like... who's the one that worked on it out in Area 51?
Bob Lazar?
No. This guy was a German, Mengele.
Okay.
Mengele was intrigued by this, and reportedly he went out through the rat line to Area 51 and worked on this. So MK Ultra has a pretty long past, but nobody really hears about it. And what's interesting also is they had Stansfield Turner before them, and he admitted that, yeah, it does exist. Do you want to give a thumbnail as to what MK Ultra does?
Okay, MK Ultra was basically the experiments conducted by the Central Intelligence Agency, and I won't go too far into it because this is really something that Philip wanted to touch upon.
Okay.
And all, but still, it bears mentioning. It's important, so we do need to look at some of this. Using the pretext once again of communist encroachment, which was one of the favorites of the establishment. The Central Intelligence Agency said that they had to begin doing experiments into mind control and into creating a Manchurian candidate. And once again, this went back to a fear of communism. Cardinal Menzetti, who his so-called confession was considered to be under some kind of duress from, was brought about through some kind of mind control practices on the part of the Soviet Union. So the idea was, well, if they have it, we're going to have to enter into a race with them for perfecting it, kind of just like the arms race that we had at the time with the Soviet Union. So the through the Central Intelligence Agency and through these different conduits that the Central Intelligence Agency had, these different doctors were brought in, and different ways of different methods of mind control were considered and were put forward, mainly dealing with drugs, LSD. There was one very famous case where an individual who was given LSD without his knowledge, and ended up either jumping out a window or being flung out a window, depending on what you believe concerning that. I believe the man's name was Olson.
Yeah, it was Frank Olson, and he had been at a party and he had been dosed without his knowing it.
Exactly.
But that supposed suicide was a result of him being enough destabilized that he was going to go up and seek psychiatric help. And it's widely suspected that probably 2 or 3 people grabbed him and threw him through the window out onto the street.
That's correct. I have a tendency to believe that he did not commit suicide. That it was a James Forrestal like situation, if you will. Mm-hmm. And but that's what MK Ultra was all about. And MK Ultra does not exist in as far as that name goes anymore. But the whole project and the whole race did not cease to exist. It went private, and it went into several different private sectors, and it did involve some occult practices in the hope of creating a Manchurian candidate, and I'll let Phil basically dig into that next time you speak with us. It involves the Human Ecology Fund. It involves B.F. Skinner's writings and whatnot. But it's such a voluminous topic. People really need to look into it. And there's even questions right now if this whole thing that's going on with Jeff Gannon, who many people believe is Johnny Gosh, if that isn't in some way a continuation of MK Ultra through another project which people believe to be called Monarch.
Right. We're coming up on the end of the show, and also for that Frank Olson story, you can just put that in a search engine, and you will find the Sun, who is continuing as much of an investigation as he can do into the death of his dad. I see one other thing, and you just jogged my memory. And we can go out on this. Harry and I were talking about this. We couldn't scratch our memories for what the deal was. Forrestal was off, was he not?
Yes. The thing to realize with Forrestal is that the administration put him in Bethesda when it had no authority to do so. People that were not in the know as far as what he knew took his actions as paranoia. But if you look at what he was saying was going on, you'll find that it's 100% correct.
And that was his crime. Paul, thanks very much for being with us for this Part 8 of our series, and we'll be looking for you in Part 9.
Okay, see you then.
God bless you. Take care.
God bless.
They weren't deprogrammed. So with this idea of a techno/human being, Do you think that's in the offing for the military?
I see it definitely coming into being. I saw this, however, coming even without the technological augmentation. People have got to understand that going straight back to the Civil War, the elites found that there was this fundamental problem that they had to deal with when getting the common man to become a combatant. During the Civil War, it was found that people were hesitant to fire on one another when they realized and when they knew that the other person that they were firing on, whether they were wearing a gray or a blue uniform, was another American. And so the elite began to look into this problem through different study groups, through different think tanks, on how do you break down this timidity, these reservations that one might have when it comes to when it comes to fighting somebody and killing somebody that on a regular basis you might consider your friend. And we've seen the breaking down of this timidity, so to speak, these reservations through training with virtual reality, with training with computer programs where it becomes almost instinctual. It becomes simply reactive, and the part of the mind that looks into serious moral questions actually switches off. And
this is part 8 of, I guess, a 10-part series that we've entitled Magicians of Mutability. And with us for this hour is Paul Collins, his books, The Hidden Face of Terrorism, and the one he co-authored with his brother Philip, The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship. They've been the series, you know the full title, and you probably don't want me to say it anymore, but at any rate. Paul, we thank you for being with us for this part 8.
Glad to be here, Viz. All
right, now, where we left off, and we were talking, central to this whole interview, as it was to part 7, was the Abu Ghraib piece that you wrote about this kind of torture taking place and its role, perhaps, in our sociology. But something that's part and parcel of an elite supremacy doctrine. Was that in place prior to 9/11? And if so, who might be, the chief advocate of such?
Yes, we do see the practice of this elite supremacy doctrine prior to September 11th, Viz. And we see it, the key practitioner, as far as, we see it going back literally thousands of years into antiquity, but that was so voluminous I could, of course, not in the length of an article and all. But the key practitioner that I looked at when it came to this supremacy doctrine was the individual known as Robert McNamara. He was the Secretary of Defense at one time, and he was a key practitioner of this elite tradition. And McNamara devised what was known as Project 100,000. And most Americans have no idea what this project was. They're completely ignorant to the fact that it even went on in this country. Once again, we have this problem where there's a veil over the common American's eyes, and the person is simply reactive.
Well, first of all, let me say this. I think you might have seen some of the video that was sent back via the internet about some of the way that, our soldiers talked, and maybe they're not the only ones, but some of the, I guess you would want to say, controlled, very calm manner in which they talked about taking a life.
Yes, it would make Hitler cringe.
Yeah, and I mean, the one, I don't know if you saw that, where they've got a wounded Iraqi laying out in the street, and they just basically talk about him, and they shoot him. It's like, wow, is that awesome?
Yeah, while I have not seen the footage, I have read extensively about that. And again, what we see is this switching off of the part of the mind that questions the moral ramifications of one's behavior, and the simply switching into a gear where it becomes reactive. It becomes it becomes little more than the equivalent of swatting a fly. And I would like to suggest that somebody who has written extensively about the kind of indoctrination that we see here, and which involved also certain individuals involved in the MK Ultra experiments, would be an individual. He's a little bit left of center. I would say that to the audience before they go reading him. So take that with tongue in cheek. But is the author Frank Morales. And he's written extensively about this, about how this paradigm shift in the way that the common soldier thinks has this veil that says, well, the hollowed halls of officialdom, my government, Uncle Sam, would never do anything harmful towards me, and would never act in a harmful way. And this naive, childish want to and desire to believe the best in the established authority and whatnot, which I can see to a point. Everybody needs some security, but in this case, it's kept people from seeing certain facts concerning certain players within our government, and it's kept people from seeing certain case studies. And one of those case studies, as I mentioned, is the Project 100,000, looking to protect some of his rich friends from the draft. And he arranged for the recruitment of people who had failed the armed services test to actually go into the military. Originally, these people, because they had failed the armed services test, were considered ineligible. But through his arrangements through this Project 100,000, these men were actually let in. Men who had failed their IQ test, people from the underclass, from the urban ghettos, the poor rural South. These people were the people who were brought in to the military through Project 100,000. 41% of Project 100,000 were African American, and 40% of Project 100,000 were trained for combat. Now, what people have to keep in mind, Viz, when we're looking at this, is that these guys ended up in Vietnam during a time when McNamara, if you look at his public statements, well, actually not his public statements, but look at the different biographies out there over the man, and what we now know, what has been disclosed. McNamara was at this time privately confessing his sentiment that the war could not be won. So these poor individuals were essentially being sent on what McNamara knew to be a suicide mission. And another thing that people have to consider was that this was 1966, the time that the civil rights movement was gaining ground. So equality may have been in vogue, but the elite tradition had McNamara going in the opposite direction, and he was waging what I would call essentially class warfare against the people. Even though there was supposed to be this paradigm shift going on, where dignity and mutual respect between the different so-called races of humanity was gaining ground.
Thinking about this eliteness and what's going on right now, do you think that we're headed for a more perfect beast of a soldier by any kind of implants? We had on again Dr. Daigle, who said that black ops or special ops are chipped in at least 3 locations, one of which is to find out where they are on the battlefield at all times, and then he led he was led to talk about what the other 2 might be for, and how when they had that rash of murders down in Fort Bragg from soldiers coming back from Iraq, that maybe perhaps